Hello and welcome to IO Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we are discussing EU citizenship, a legal status that promises equal rights across Europe but operates through market logic, empowering individuals while constraining nation states in unexpected ways. We'll explore whether EU citizenship can truly deliver justice and equality, or whether it's fundamentally compromised by its origins in economic integration rather than in democratic ideals. Our guest today is Dimitry Kochenov. Hello?
It's a pleasure.
Professor Dimitry Kochenov studies global citizenship and constitutionalism, focusing on the rule of law, EU federalism, and external relations law. He leads the Rule of Law Research Group at the Central European University Democracy Institute in Budapest and teaches global citizenship at the Central European University in Vienna. His publication record is truly impressive, and I will include all the links into YouTube video description. But I want to mention his book published by the MIT Press, Citizenship, where he argues that citizenship is not inherently beneficial and calls for an end to passport apartheid. And I think this is a very interesting sentence. And if we link this sentence to the EU, we have a great topic for our debate today. Let's start with the first question, and let's start with something fundamental. EU citizenship doesn't exist in a traditional sense because the EU is not a country or state, but an institution. Institutions, unlike states, cannot normally issue citizenship. For instance, NATO is also an institution, yet there is no such a thing as NATO citizenship. To what extent is this logic relevant to the debate on EU citizenship?
Well, it's an open question. What is citizenship in this regard? Whether a state is necessary for citizenship to exist? The EU doesn't think so, and since citizenship as a concept is the creation of the law, it takes one legal system that can claim a population for itself, actually to establish something that will be called citizenship. That's why empires had citizenship, sub-empires had citizenship, colonies had some kind of belonging status, which is well, nothing else but citizenship. And we throughout history we have plenty of examples of legal statuses akin to what we now call citizenship, granted by all kinds of entities. Even sometimes there are several concurrent statuses of this type will be granted by the same entity or the same sovereign. Think about the UK today, for instance. There's citizenship of the UK, which we're all used to, but there are also individual citizenships issued by the Channel Islands in their capacity of territories which are not incorporated into the UK, but hold allegiance to the same monarch in his capacity of the Duke of Normandy. Then there's also a separate passport and separate citizenship for the Isle of Man. There are plenty of overseas statuses which are issued by the same monarch and by the same state in relation to the kind of colonial possessions that are still kept by this entity. So in fact, if you can have 7 or 8 different citizenships issued under the same flag, although of course the majority of them would not recognize that flag, this whole connection between citizenship and statehood is deeply problematic. In fact, if we look at the core of what citizenship is about, the right to cross boundaries and the right to stay in a particular territory, then we will easily discover that plenty of international organizations, including the UN, will issue travel documents to its staff. The European Union issues travel documents to its staff. Sovereign orders of the Catholic Church issue passports like the Maltese Knights, and of course the Holy See itself, not being a state, issues its own passports, kind of on behalf of the city of Vatican. So the idea behind citizenship is that an authority claims a population for itself, and then what kind of an authority that is. It can be an absolute monarchy. It can be an order of chivalry. It can be a state. It can be an empire. It can be a colony. That's an open question. So in this sense, EU citizenship is not as exotic as the citizenship of the state of New York, the citizenship of the canton of Zug, or the citizenship of the Dutch Empire, which existed in many nations. So let's not be overexcited about how different it is. And having said that, of course, it is very different because international law is not obliged, or no actor in international law is obliged to recognize it actually as citizenship. So to say that it's a true citizenship that will fit into the whole complex of international rules and norms that, for instance, fight statelessness, we will not be honest if we make this kind of claim. So if you somehow, now it's impossible, but who knows about tomorrow, end up with EU citizenship only without any nationality of any member state, then you will still be stateless in the eyes of international law.
There was one question from students when I was teaching, and I mentioned a few things about the citizenship, and they asked me, what about if there is a person without citizenship? Is this even possible in this world? Or each individual is basically a citizen and citizenship is automatically adjusted or attached to him or her?
So the ideal situation is that, and the ideal situation, I'm not saying that approvingly, I'm saying that as a statement of what international law is trying to achieve, is that all the population of the globe is divided between different authorities that claim those individuals as their own, and this is what citizenship is about. So statelessness, a personal state when you're not claimed by any authority, is presented as an anomaly. So it's something that international law fights against, and there are two conventions against this that date back to the 50s, to the 60s, which present it as something that is repugnant to human nature, while at the same time, if we think about it a little bit, it's easily apparent that in fact very often it's much better to be stateless rather than to belong to a state that gives you a third-rate kind of set of rights with the citizenship that is distributed to you. And I tried to delve into this question a little bit. So together with Chris Kellin of Hamlin Partners, who is a famous scholar as well in the field of citizenship, not EU citizenship in particular, we did a quality of nationality index, which I can show here, which was published by Bloomsbury 5 years ago, last emanation. And now we haven't updated it for 5 years, but it's not about the updates. It's about simply showing the cleavage that exists between different citizenships around the world if we approach them from the point of view of rights. So there are some citizenships like the Swiss one, which grants you not only visa-free travel, not only all around the world, not only the right to reside in Switzerland as long as you want, but also full access, as if holding additional statuses of 48 other countries that would not be able to discriminate against you on the basis of your Swiss document. So you will be accepted as one of us in France. You will be accepted as one of us in Iceland. You can also hope to get into Liechtenstein. There are difficulties with that, but in fact, the passport is so good and the citizenship is so good that it equals almost 50 of the best, richest countries' citizenships of this world. And then if you compare this with the statuses issued by Afghanistan, by the Central African Republic, by Madagascar, these are the statuses that cage you in, because you will never be able to cross the border. You will not get any rights protected at all in the space which is officially fenced off as the space to which those citizenships entitle you, which means that you're totally brought down by that status. And this is the starting point of my theorizing of citizenship as also a vehicle of victimhood. So the majority of people in the world, obviously they don't inhabit the European Union, Canada, or the United States. They're actually the victims of this paradigm. And as victims of citizenship, they're deprived of any rights globally based on the citizenship that has been assigned to them, which means that if you are stateless, but this statelessness comes with the right to settle in a place of privilege, like Switzerland, like Germany, like the US, then you're infinitely better off compared with someone who has a citizenship, say, of Madagascar, which is not great at all, and which doesn't allow you to travel in the direction of the most privileged spaces. And this creates a paradox, of course, because you're much worse off in Switzerland with a Madagascar passport than you would be in Switzerland with a document saying you are stateless. Because a stateless person will produce a Swiss child automatically, rather than a Madagascar document barrier. A stateless person cannot be deported from the space of privilege to some other place, and the stateless person is supposed to have his or her rights fully protected, precisely under international law. So this whole paradigm of international law that presumes that all the citizenships are the same, the citizenship of Madagascar is the same to the citizenship of Switzerland, is actually an absurd non-starter, because it veils the underlying currents of privilege which only benefit a small part of the world population compared with the whole. So for the whole, sometimes being stateless is better. And in this context, fighting statelessness, which is proclaimed by international law as a noble cause, can actually destroy lives and undermine the quality of individual experiences as mandated by law. Think about trying to find any kind of passport for someone, say a child found stateless in the middle of Berlin. It might lead you to all kinds of grandparents. Citizenship is transferred by blood. All kinds of great grandparents that could trace their origins to totally different spaces, and then you use the pretext of fighting for the right of that child to have nationality in order to make sure that that child is deported as far as possible from the space of privilege and is deprived of any rights whatsoever. So in this sense, I think this citizenism paradigm that everybody has a citizenship in the world, and it's an anomaly if someone doesn't, and that citizenship is something great, and it's an anomaly when we say what it really is, that very many citizenships are not great at all. This paradigm doesn't serve the people. It only serves the state, the states wanting to safeguard the boundaries, especially between the most privileged spaces and the least privileged spaces. And here, if I can say a couple of words explaining why I speak about spaces all the time. This is a gentle reference to Branko Milanovic's work, who is a famous historian of inequalities, whose research shows, and there is other literature along these lines as well. But the most impressive is probably his contribution, his two books with Harvard University Press on the history of global inequality. So what he claims is that 200 years ago, inequalities were arranged along the lines of class. And this is what citizenship was created to address. So a French count was not equal in the eyes of the law to a French peasant and to a French merchant, which creates tensions and creates problems. So how do you equalize them? You proclaim that all of them, although some of them are beautiful, some of them are brutish, some of them are rich, others are very poor, some of them are super smart and well educated, others are desperately dumb. You say we ignore all that, and we create an abstract status of belonging to this particular legal system, which will then be the entry ticket to claim equality before the law. This is what citizenship was about, and it addressed the inequalities as they emerged at that time. Today, it's totally different, because today inequalities are spatialized. Today, it's not about whether you are a count or a peasant in France. It's about whether you are only entitled to live in the Central African Republic, and otherwise you'll be shot at the border, because your visa will never be issued, and it's unlikely that you will ever be granted any travel document. So there is no education, there is no decent work, there is no pay for your work, and there is no hope if you are assigned to the space, or you are assigned to Switzerland, and then the world is at your feet. So citizenship, which was designed to fight global inequality, understood as class by precisely revolting against blood-based hierarchies, the aristocracy principle, emerged in the end as the main defender and the main enforcer of precisely that, the general blood aristocracy principle. And given that it's distributed by birth, we have what we have. That's why I think we should speak about citizenship as a negative legal development now in the 21st century, compared with its positive and forward-looking roots when it was first emerging in the modern sense in Napoleonic France.
And it's also fascinating how we can see that international dimension of citizenship, because many people, they accept citizenship as something automatic. They are born, they got passport, some ID in the pocket, and basically that's it. They don't think about other implications. I want to mention two things about the EU citizenship. The first one is the Court of Justice of the European Union stated that the EU citizenship is a fundamental status of nationals of the member states. And you describe EU citizenship as a curious legal status perched on limitations. And when I travel to the EU, within the EU or abroad, overseas, I have my citizenship. But I never said or never used EU citizenship. So how is it? Is there a real EU citizenship? Or is this just the concept of the European Union that it's, as we say, half-baked? It's there, but it's not there.
Well, in fact, it depends on your original nationality. If we are speaking about serious conflicts with or serious contact with EU citizenship, if you are Maltese and you are ever in trouble anywhere in the world, the chances that you will encounter a Maltese ambassador or a Maltese consulate are close to zero. The same will be the case with the Latvians, with the Slovaks, etc. You simply have to rely on someone else, and that's when EU citizenship kicks in outside of the territory of the EU. But of course, the sobering note here is that you don't need EU citizenship for that. When Mr. Notable, the protagonist of the most famous case on citizenship international law, traveled to Guatemala on his Liechtenstein passport, he got himself registered in Guatemala with the Swiss consulate, precisely because there was an arrangement between Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And this kind of bilateral arrangements are with us all around the world. So this is not the core of what EU citizenship is about. And then if we think about the core, reading the treaties, the citizenship is presented to us, and also in the case law of the Court of Justice, as something radically new. And in fact, you might be misled to believe that this is indeed the case. Why? Think about the citizenship of any successful nation state, or any standard nation state. Brazil, India, the US, Canada. What is the main message that this status is sending to you? That's that the state is there for you, and the state cares for you, and the state will make sure that you are treated better than anyone who doesn't have the legal status. Which means that America is for Americans, India is for Indians, Canada is for Canadians, not for some Swiss and not for some not for some Kazakhstanis, etc. Obviously, this is the starting point of the idea of legitimacy in contemporary constitutional law. Citizens inhabit a certain space, and then that certain space is the place where they govern themselves through making laws or having laws made in their name, and then they rejoice in having this small fief for themselves. EU citizenship is totally different, because EU citizenship is based on one core principle, which is non-discrimination, precisely on the basis of nationality. So EU citizenship sends a message to all the 27 member states and nationalities of the member states that, in fact, the starting point of the status is that it doesn't matter what kind of specific nationality you have. In this sense, EU citizenship is the denial of the constitutional ABC of contemporary world. If you post an ad in Estonia saying we are looking for a street sweep, and if that person is not Estonian, then please don't bother, it will not work because it will be a direct violation of EU law. Nationality cannot matter. And in this sense, there is interesting literature on that. Gareth Davis, who is at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, described it as a direct attack, as the abolition of the nationalities of the member states. And if we take it as such, then EU citizenship is both empowering and dangerous. It's dangerous because obviously it questions the basic constitutional narrative of all the constituent parts of the union. It means that when France says that we are a republic of equals who democratically make the dream of the common future possible in this territory, and this is what French democracy is about. Well, EU citizenship disagrees, and the EU citizenship is there precisely to undermine this kind of a narrative. And it's empowering because if you take your whatever EU passport and come to France cannot, in the majority of cases, treat you as if you don't actually belong to that society. So all the rules applicable to you will be radically different compared with what France applies to third country nationals, so-called, to those who don't have EU nationality at all. And this creates a beast with two heads. The first head, EU citizenship, is an assault on what the member states think about themselves and about their peoples. But the second head, EU citizenship can actually empower an individual against the member state where that individual chose to reside. And this kind of clash is particularly interesting because the EU doesn't replace the national legitimacy and democracy narrative with anything at all, which means that you assault the ABC, the core of French constitutionalism, but you don't offer any constitutionalism in return. And this is something that Professor Weiler has been arguing throughout his career since his seminal article in the Yale Law Journal in 1991, volume 100. He simply said, well, if you really believe in citizenship and if you push it so far, then what is absolutely indispensable is to make sure that this citizenship actually operates as a constitutional status. It cannot be simply something antagonistic to what the member states established. It has to have a proactive value, which would allow us to build a future for all the Europeans, both states and persons, together in a way when, well, we can in some way replicate nationalities of the member states at the supranational level. But for that, you need a different idea of the rule of law, you need a different idea of democracy, and you need equality between all the inhabitants in front of the law. And this is the third and the last element, which I think is the most problematic, because if you think about citizenship for real, if what you quoted from the Court of Justice was really true, then the starting point is making sure that the law applies equally to all. And surprise, surprise, this is not what the EU is about. The EU has never claimed that it will somehow replace all the member states. And in fact, if you read the Maastricht Declaration on Citizenship, the declaration that ended up appended to the treaties because the Danes were afraid that precisely this kind of replacement would ever happen, the declaration is quite clear. The EU citizenship is not supposed to replace the nationalities of the member states. And then how does equality work at the supranational level then? The EU comes up with some kind of triggers of jurisdiction. They are not in the treaties, they are in the case law of the Court of Justice, which absolutely contradict outright and 100% this maxim of the fundamental status. Because if the fundamental status is a real citizenship, which is a status of equals in the eyes of the law, then what to do with all these cross-border situations? What to do with the framing of the supranational law as a law that is not dependent on the personal legal status, such as EU citizenship or nationality of the member state, or not dependent on the personal legal status only, but dependent on two things, and always on two things: personal legal status plus the material scope of EU law. And in this sense, if the material scope of EU law is, these are the areas where the EU has legislated, these are the areas which apply only to a certain microscopic number of Europeans who actually chose to travel between the member states. If that is all, then EU citizenship is about equality between a microscopic share of Europeans at the expense of throwing everybody else under the bus. To give a very simple example, you can have two French people living in Paris in the same Haussmannian wonderful building, sharing the same staircase entrance. One of them will be educated at Sorbonne and will be a professor there. Another one will be educated in Amsterdam and will be a professor there. And then both of them fall in love with Sri Lankan ladies. Well, EU law will apply to one and will not apply to another, because one has exercised free movement rights, one is within the scope, material scope of EU law, only personal scope is not enough, and then the second one will be within the realm of national law of France. If we look at the majority of the member states, they of course treat plenty of issues which are regulated by law differently from the EU. And the EU law is sometimes more liberal. Sometimes it's harsher, but usually almost never it's harsher, actually. In the majority of cases, it's more liberal, which means that in the majority of the member states, it will be impossible for you to be joined by a spouse from far away, from the places which are frowned upon by the majority of European citizens. Well, a democracy of vile people will be vile, as Professor Weiler has also taught us. So one will have a happy family life, while the other won't, because he chose the wrong partner, or she chose the wrong partner. And this is exactly how equality doesn't work in the European Union. While the European Union pretends, or the European Court of Justice pretends, that equality is a fundamental principle of EU law, this is of course nonsense once you look at the situation of the individuals in the European continent. Because all those are unequally distributed between the two legal systems. And that distribution doesn't depend on the constitutional maxims proclaimed in the constitutions of all those member states. Because when France tells us that liberté, égalité, fraternité, those are the fundamental starting points of French constitutionalism, all that doesn't apply to those who are carved out by EU law from the body of French citizens to whom this constitution is kind of value, which means that EU citizenship by definition is an assault on the idea of equality and makes it impossible to have any kind of modern legal conversation, rather replacing everything with a pre-modern ideal of liberty. When you look at someone's CV, at someone's travel history and the nationality of the partner, bank account, and then you decide, yes, this person is a worthy European, she has contributed to the internal market, that's great, so we will authorize her to be equal to other people in the same private, in the same well-scrutinized situation, while all the others, we don't care. And this creates a citizenship which basically brings down everybody whom it chooses to disregard. Because if you want help from the European Union, in the majority of cases, it will not be granted. And it's not because the EU is so evil. It's because the EU is structured along the lines of only seeing those who are already in a preferential kind of position compared with the majority of Europeans. The others will not be even noticeable. This is a law that is designed not to notice those guys who are in trouble. And if you don't notice those guys who are in trouble, then of course whatever you proclaim about rights makes very little sense, because if someone is rich, well educated, and willing to explore the world, contribute to the internal market in the language of Eurospeak, in the sense that bureaucrats would intend in Brussels, then in the majority of cases, those people don't actually need, or they would not be dependent on all those rights that EU citizenship brings with it. And then if you are faced with a desperate, difficult situation of someone who is in a radically different position for one reason or another, it doesn't matter what reason, then the EU will not protect you. So unlike other citizenships, especially if we look at the citizenships as they were understood after the Second World War, citizenships coming with a baggage of socioeconomic rights, with the idea of a kind of safety net that exists within a particular society. If any kind of citizenship like that is counterimposed and compared with the citizenship of the European Union is precisely the antithesis of this kind of safety net. Once you say, I need a safety net, the European Union it basically peddles the flush button, and you are down, and you are out, and you are invisible. There's a great example, if I may give an example, in the case law of the European Court of Justice itself, the case of McCarthy, the first McCarthy case, unrelated to the second, of course, it's just the same name. So the lady lives in the UK. The case came to the court before Brexit. The lady lives in the UK. The lady has a handicapped child in need of 24/7 care. Because of that, she cannot really work or live a life. And finally, she finds a partner, a Jamaican gentleman. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because UK law doesn't believe that Jamaicans should have a right to stay in the UK. So under UK law, the law applies to that particular woman in such a way that her family immediately is destroyed. Her source of income and her help, financial and emotional and otherwise, coming from her loved one, is ignored and smashed, destroyed, and annihilated. The partner is deported, and then she again is chased into the safety net of miserable gifts of charity coming from the UK state to live this life alone with her child. What is the way out of here? The way out of here was to try to invoke EU law, because the EU doesn't care about what the member states think about Jamaican husbands. So if she could prove that as an EU citizen she is within the material scope of EU law, her husband would be with her. She would have enough money. She would start normal social life, and everybody will be better off. So how do you create a cross-border situation if you need to provide 24/7 care? You try to find another passport in the EU, because a cross-border situation is about not having the same document as the ones which are issued by the place where you happen to reside. So as many people in the UK, she was entitled to an Irish passport. She got one, and then she tells the British government, look, I am an Irish woman exercising free movement rights, and I want protection of EU law, because as an EU citizen, I believe I should be entitled. Well, all the EU citizens falling within the material scope of EU law are entitled to have their spouse. It was clear that potentially the family could be helped by EU law. But EU law is based on the idea of contributing to the internal market. So the Court of Justice then looked at the situation of this lady living alone with her handicapped child, crossed out the facts about the handicapped child from the judgment, and said EU law cannot help anyone who has never worked, which means that the EU put a seal of approval on the harsh national regulation that is most irrational as applied to this case. And while it could help and save the family of this woman, it decided to punish her precisely for the disability of her child. So she was punished twice: once by God, the second time by the EU, and of course the UK as well. But this case is not an exception. In fact, there is a growing literature documenting this kind of cases. The leading voice in this literature is Charlotte O'Brien, who is a professor at York. a spectacular, forceful lady who makes this argument with crystal clarity. Her most famous book is Unity in Adversity, about precisely how the EU always ignores all those who are in need of help. Of course, if you are an EU bureaucrat and you have a huge salary and your partner is also an EU bureaucrat and you have a child with 7 passports, then the Court of Justice will protect the right of the child in the light of future movement across the non-existent borders in the internal market to have the name spelled in the same way across nationalities. But this is not what interests the majority of people who are really in a desperate situation. So EU citizenship emerges as a citizenship for the good, where the good is determined by the EU in such a way that all those who are in need of protection are thrown under the bus.
There are 2 questions, I think, naturally following this case and idea. You have been writing about the EU citizenship as a concept that promote democratic values, but also undermining those outcomes or values at the same time. And some people might think it's sort of contradictory. Can you explain in which way? And the second question, why is there a tension between the EU's promise of non-discrimination and the reality of unequal treatment among citizens?
So I think these are very different questions, but both of them have a huge value for the understanding of what EU citizenship is about. And if we start with democracy, I think I actually have difficulty remembering my praise of EU citizenship that would relate to its democratic nature, because in fact I think it might be that my views have radically changed without me noticing, but the majority of examples that I have studied actually point in the direction quite the opposite compared with any kind of democratic nature, because EU citizenship is designed in such a way that those who actually do use the rights of EU citizenship are the ones who are attacked by the EU in terms of being stripped of any democratic rights. Because EU citizenship, although the treaties offer a possibility to upgrade the actual rights that citizens enjoy, this article in the second part of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union has never been used in practice, which means that EU citizens have never acquired the right of the most consequential democratic representation or democratic participation that we know in the world today, which is the national level. EU citizens, So when you move from Poland to Estonia, you don't vote in Estonia, where you reside and where all your interests are. You might vote in Poland. And actually, in many member states, you don't vote anywhere, because once you're out, which means that the use of EU citizenship rights proclaimed as the panacea for the creation of the internal market very frequently comes at a huge cost. That huge cost is the very central idea of citizenship if we connect citizenship with democracy. Of course, I would be skeptical about this kind of connection, because if we move one level up and look at citizenship globally, the majority of citizens of the world have never lived in democracy and never will. So democracy is not a necessary condition at all when we speak about citizenship. Everybody has citizenship, with a small exception of those who are stateless. That's a minuscule minority. But among those who have citizenship, a minority lives in a democracy. So democracy is not about citizenship. But when the Court of Justice tells us that EU citizenship is about democracy, it's difficult to comment on that seriously, because the starting point of the EU was precisely taming the democracies of the member states. This is what on this we have absolute agreement in the academic literature. In fact, Professor Wilkinson from LSE wrote a whole monograph that Oxford published on totalitarian liberalism, or authoritarian liberalism rather. And that's the way to understand and to conceptualize the European Union. The whole idea underpinning the Union is to remove any kind of voice from the people at the national level when we speak about deciding on a handful of essentially important matters. And this concerns economic governance. This concerns treating the other, especially those coming from other member states. This concerns the monetary policies. This concerns plenty of things. This concerns solidarity. Whom should you be helping as a citizen? And I'm not a huge fan of all this kind of solidaristic proclamations, but it's obvious that the EU has always been an example of tension when we compare it with normal democratic principles, rather than giving democracy a voice. So in this sense, EU citizenship is anti-democratic citizenship, because if you don't use your rights, you're not really a citizen of the European Union, as we've seen with McCarthy, because the EU will frown upon you if you don't work in the way how the EU wants you to work, if you don't travel in the way how the EU wants to travel, and there is a lot of case law on this. If you commute between Brussels and the Flemish parts of the Belgian Federation, well, then you're not within the scope of EU law, because you cross an invisible border, but this is not the right one. If you commute between Brussels and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, then yes, and then you will be entitled to some supranational protections. But this kind of borders, we have to realize this fully, are invisible, and the whole principle that underpins the activation, so-called, of EU citizenship is the principle that you are giving full voice to the internal market as the starting point of what the EU citizenship is about, and the internal market is about making those borders non-existent. So unless you cross a border which the EU has pledged to abolish, you are not really under the protection of the EU. And there are plenty of other borders, but those don't come into the picture and don't play any role whatsoever. And then historically, if we look at democratic claims and equality claims, also coming to your second question, in fact, the EU remains a very, very weird beast if we look at it from the basic constitutional premises that are accepted at the national level and also elsewhere in the world. Because the EU was designed to make a strict distinction between different classes of its populations in terms of how the law will apply to them. So, to put it simply, equality before the law is not part of this equation, because the EU, of course, is coming to it comes into being as a coming together of colonial empires. And then colonial empires were basically racist in the way how they organized the management of those under their sovereignty. So it was race, it was not citizenship or particular belonging that would be fundamental. And the EU has exported this racism through enlargements and elsewhere and otherwise. So if we recall the accession of the United Kingdom to the EU, there was, of course, the UK was then an empire in the process of fast deterioration. But there were plenty of Brits everywhere in the world, and those Brits were kind of different from the majority core European population. Let's put it that way. So from the ethno-racist kind of perspective, those were the wrong people. And this is exactly what the Dutch government, on behalf of all the founding member states, informed the United Kingdom about. There are curious testimonies in the Common Market Law Review in the early 70s about how this happened and why. So the Dutch basically said, all of our friends here in the European communities think that all the kind of non-English British citizens and non-European British citizens should not be granted any rights whatsoever in the EU. I mean, they were not speaking about the EU back then, but this is what the conversation was about. And they pushed the UK to bring a unilateral declaration saying, yes, indeed, actually, the majority of our citizens who don't trace their ancestry through one of the grandparents to the British Isles will not be considered British nationals for the purposes of EEC law, as the EU law was known back then, which means that plenty of British citizens were basically considered as foreigners in the internal market. And this is not something that was new in the 70s, not at all, because the same applied to plenty of colonial possessions that the original empires had in mind. So it's not that EU law was supposed to apply to Français Africains, not at all. It's not that EU law was supposed to apply to colonial status of status holders of belonging that the Dutch Empire was distributing everywhere in Suriname and in Indonesia and elsewhere. So the starting point of the EU is that the equality before the law is not a founding principle, and that we will have a white population and other populations, and they will have different rights and different duties in the internal market. So when we speak about the peoples of Europe, what we find in the preambles of the treaties since 1950s, this is not really about everybody who held citizenship. It's not about the non-white guys. It's about a strictly delimited group of ethno-culturally determined people who were proclaimed Europeans. There's an excellent article on this, looking at the history of the drafting of the treaties and how the founding fathers went about navigating this racist ideology, and that is an article which was written by Hanne Eklund in the Icon, which is one of the leading journals in comparative constitutional law field. And that's precisely her claim. She's now almost done editing a book for Cambridge on this. But then you would say, what's the matter with history? Who cares about these things today? And in fact, the EU remains what it was designed to be. And since it was designed to precisely deny equality before the law to all, it does exactly that in two ways. Firstly, to its own citizens. That's why Miss McCarthy was basically thrown under the bus because she never worked, paying for the handicap of her child, and then forget about any rights in the EU. The EU is not for her. So equality before the law is understood as equality before the law for those who are branded as good enough by the EU, where citizenship doesn't actually play a fundamental role. And then secondly, and most importantly, if you look at the situation of third country nationals, those who don't have an EU passport in the European Union, that's really a drama because there is no European Union for them. This is what I called with my co-author, Sarah Ganti, who is at Yale Law School, a disappearance act. It's like a rabbit in the top hat. Because if you take a German passport, a Portuguese passport, a Dutch passport, and think about the rights that you have, the main rights, especially if we think about citizenship and inequalities in terms of territory, come from the EU, because it's not about the Dutch territory or Portuguese territory. It's about the territory of the Union as such. It's about the ability to work, the ability to reside, the ability to travel, and the ability not to be discriminated against in that whole space that comes with your passport, which is essentially an EU passport. Now think about an American who is a permanent resident, say in Amsterdam. For that person, the whole scope of rights and the whole territory of opportunities is the territory of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Not even the kingdom; it will be the Netherlands in Europe, the Dutch part of the kingdom, plus the three overseas islands. So EU law as such doesn't exist for foreigners. And in this sense, this is really a neo-feudal, neo-medieval kind of system. Because not only does it bring down its own if they're weak, if they're in trouble, it also pretends that it's not there for all those who haven't been proclaimed by that very system to belong. And it's particularly harsh in the context of decolonization, because and there's a huge case law on this. Imagine you are an elderly lady who were Dutch yesterday. Today you are not, and you still want to continue residing with your son, who is Dutch, because at the moment of separation of Suriname from the Netherlands, he happened to be in Amsterdam. And then the Dutch, in full accordance with the EU law, will be deporting you back home, the home which you acquired, legally speaking, 2 days ago, when Suriname stopped being part of the Dutch kingdom, and your rights don't exist because you don't have any right to be in a member state of the European Union. You don't have any right to free movement. You don't have any right to equality. So it's a strict separation between different groups of people which are determined based on the personal factors unrelated to the citizenship status that the EU is about.
I think it's fascinating how a citizenship is also revealing how the EU works internally, or as we might say, behind the scenes. So that's a good, I think, research lens as well for many researchers. In your writings, you use market citizenship as a concept. And I'm asking about this because there is a sort of commodifying human beings according to employability and mobility. What's the logic of market citizenship? And maybe in 2 sentences, you might explain what does it mean in EU? Because I think that might be slightly different meaning in EU and elsewhere.
Well, market citizenship is a bizarre non-starter, of course, because and in fact there is a huge literature. It's not my formulation. This is what Niv Shivney, who is a professor in Edinburgh, has written a lot about. This is what other scholars have commented abundantly on. But the idea in the EU is that the EU pretends that our common good depends on the success of precisely abolishing the boundaries between the member states. And that's the EU idea of the market. So if you have a super successful startup in Amsterdam and you pay billions in taxes and you employ dozens of thousands of people and you make something indispensable for the European Union as a whole and the planet at large, you're not really contributing to the internal market. Because and they are not really a citizen of the union. I mean, not that you will need any kind of additional rights that would come from that status if you are that successful. But for the EU, the success of the market comes through basic creation of physical scale in terms of economic activity. So if your company then establishes a branch in Bremen or starts hiring en masse from Greece, then there is a kind of talk about following the scope of the internal market, and then you'll be a good citizen within the internal market. Otherwise, if you don't cross borders, if you don't care about other places, you are nobody, and the EU will not appear for you. And of course, once again, if you don't have an EU passport, then the internal market remains ephemeral and remains a folk tale. Which is of the dream world rather than of reality. So your rights are not determined by the internal market that the EU is purporting to be building. And this is of course a flawed perspective on building a legal status that you can defend on the grounds of basic constitutional importance. Because if we look at all the well-functioning constitutional systems, the starting point of managing humans is not about making them fit better the market structures at the expense of or at the threat of being punished and thrown out of the legal system, but rather the opposite, because any modern citizenship today protects you from the negative externalities of the market, which means that market citizenship is something that is oxymoronic. It denies what citizenship normally is about. It's worse than a misnomer. And then if we know that that Dutch company that I created and gave as a hypothesis actually does shape European prosperity and actually does contribute to the internal market, then the absurdity of this construct becomes even clearer. And in this sense, the Court of Justice has always been particularly unconvincing in trying to interpret the citizenship provisions in the treaties through this strange market lens. In fact, tongue in cheek, I wrote a piece several years ago in the European Law Review, together with the late Sir Richard Plender, one of the towering figures in EU law, arguing that probably the Court of Justice failed to read the treaties, because normally if you have something in primary law, a right, a duty, whatever, a proclamation, you presume that has world-shaping legal effects. Think of Bourdieu. The law produces the world that it describes. So if you have free movement of goods in the treaties, it means that yes, goods can cross boundaries undisturbed. You cannot discriminate based on the origin of goods, etc., as long as they are lawfully in the internal market. So the law shapes its scope. Now think about EU citizenship. The main take-home lesson from all the case law of the Court of Justice is that, unfortunately, EU citizenship doesn't matter for the scope of the law. And in this sense, it's particularly interesting because it's radically different from how all the other legal fields operate in the EU. So free movement of services does shape the scope of the law. Free movement of goods does shape the scope of the law. Competition law, of course, it shapes the scope of the law. And you name it. The only area which doesn't shape the scope of the law, which means that it will not help if the Court of Justice does not individually bring you within the material scope, well, that's citizenship. So citizens are treated much, much worse in the European Union. Individuals are treated much, much worse than anything else that the EU tries to regulate. And this is a necessary element, probably, to come back to Wilkinson, of autocratic system that the EU is, autocratic liberalism, because autocratic liberalism doesn't care about you as an individual. It will tell you what is better for you. It will invent a fake democracy for you. It will explain away your plight to be treated equally and with dignity, and everything will be sold to you as if it's done in your interest, but then you will be punished for the handicap of your child. This is how the EU works, and this is why I think market citizenship is not a good starting point to discuss personhood.
And also there is a discussion that EU should abolish citizenship for sale schemes. What do you think about this?
There is an interesting case even, which is super fascinating, Commission versus Malta, which Malta lost to everybody's surprise. I edited two books, in fact, on this matter. One was called Citizenship and Residence Sales, Cambridge University Press. The latest one was Invest Migration in Europe and the World. One co-edited with Christian Surak from LSE. The other one co-edited with two colleagues, Madeleine Sampson from Oxford and Martijn van Brink from Leiden. We just looked at how EU citizenship law operates, what the constraints on EU competences are, and what the rights are that come with citizenship and have cross-border implications. So in terms of marketization, well, it's the Commission, the Parliament tried to start a moral panic, saying that citizenship is not for sale, because of course marketization goes against all the logic that EU citizenship exhibited from day one, that the European Union exhibited from day one, by separating populations based on race. Just like a Français Africain could not buy whiteness to become a real French, some other sacrifices were necessary. You had to stay somewhere for a number of years. You had to demonstrate allegiance. Otherwise, you could spill your blood in a colonial war on the side of the whites rather than on the side of your brethren, if we believe that race matters at all. So this is the starting point of the EU. And in this sense, EU citizenship for sale or not for sale debate, unfortunately, comes too close to this racist origins. And in this sense, and the best reading material on this, which is not really about marketization as such, but which is about the essence of the union as a legal system that denies equality before the law and that prioritizes a certain phenotype over others, is the work of Hans Kudnany, which appeared in 2023 with Hearst. It's called Euro-whiteness. He argues that Euro-whiteness is actually the main principle of EU law, and that this principle of EU law is something that helps us, once we keep it in mind, to interpret what the EU is doing in all its spheres of activity. I would have loved to disagree with him because it's an indictment, but I can't, Because if you think about how EU citizenship operates as a law which cannot create the scope of its own application, and how EU citizenship is designed as a citizenship of unequals before the law. And once you look at history, what Han Eklund describes, in order to understand where it all comes from, unfortunately, it becomes painfully clear that the European Union and the law as sanctioned by its member states does take the pigmentation of your skin very much into account. So if you look at the separation that exists between those who enjoy full citizenship rights in the EU and those who don't, then this is where the color line lies. If we turn to Du Bois and to the standards established in the literature of thinking about this concept. So what we are talking about here is the historical idea that the EU is only for the right people, not for the wrong people, and we all know who the wrong people are. Then the wrong people are the ideal victims of citizenship, and then here comes the moral panic. Someone can buy EU citizenship, and then someone can buy the rights of a real citizenship. And the question is, who is that someone? And the answer is very clear. You will never buy it if you have a Slovak, Lithuanian, Irish, or whatever, or Belgian passport. It would be mad, in fact, to think that you should spend $1 million or more on something that you get by blood anyway. This is how citizenship works. This is your white privilege. This is your ancestry connection. These are the right UK citizens who could find one grandmother who then would be, in the majority of cases, qualifying for an Irish passport as well, and who will be treated as the kings of the world, as opposed to all the others who don't have the right grandmother. That's why we have plenty of EU citizens in Argentina and in Brazil, and they don't need any visas. They stay as long as they want, and all of them happen to be less black than those who don't have those citizenships and those who do need a visa, while otherwise their personal histories, their education, their outlook on the world will be identical. This is exactly the essence of what Euro whiteness is about. And then if we come to the essence of the marketization claim, it basically is about thick racialized identities, because if you believe that all the good guys, meaning not too black, not too foreign, not too with the accents which are not too harsh, should receive all the rights in the world for free, while others who are victimized by this kind of distribution and who don't fit the basic racialized description, who are already brought down by how rights are distributed, they should not be even entitled to step over the bulwark that you have created. Well, that is a big problem. So what does the Court of Justice do about it? And the case was brought by the Commission against Malta, because Malta marketized EU citizenship. Of course, Malta is one among many member states who do it. Only Malta did it openly and in accordance with strict criteria, while other member states will do it for secret contributions, for undisclosed help to the state, etc. Think about Austria, think about France. Mr. Durov is not only an Emirati, he's also French. He's also Kititian, and we don't know whether he's Russian, because it's unclear whether he renounced. But the EU prefers the dark path. So if you really want to give someone a citizenship, the member states can do it. You just cannot be open about it. We don't know how much money Durov would pay to France. We don't know how much the new Austrians pay to the Austrian government, but we do know that marketization of EU citizenship is something that is not allowed after Commission versus Malta. So what is the argument in Commission versus Malta? The EU cannot itself decide who the Maltese are, right? At least that was the starting point. As the EU cannot decide who is French, the EU cannot decide who is German. This is the basic idea behind the derivative logic of the status. The treaties tell us nationals of the member states are EU citizens. So you cannot say you are EU citizens, that's why you are nationals of the member states, or vice versa. You are not anymore EU citizens, that's why you're not nationals of the member states. But the Court of Justice did precisely that. The Court of Justice tells us EU citizenship is about solidarity. And think about Euro-whiteness solidarity. That is at the starting point of framing Europeanness from 1950s on. That's why some modes of its acquisition are against solidarity between the member states, which means that and marketization is singled out as one of those modes, which means that EU citizenship for the first time emerges as something that is not only legal. So we have a legal status which is offered by the member state, plus we have and this is what the Court of Justice clearly implies, we have an undisclosed set of some other criterions of Europeanness, including your skin pigmentation, your accent, your faith, if you're religious, and probably other factors as well. And then the Court of Justice will prioritize those other factors over the legal status. So then the Court of Justice tells us that solidarity between the member states demands that Malta doesn't sell. Only Austrians can sell. And of course, there is no you might say that there's probably historical explanation. What about the starting point of EU citizenship? There was certainly no selling there. It's nonsense, of course, because Ireland had citizenship for sale at the moment when the Treaty of Maastricht was being negotiated, which means that historically, from the starting point of EU citizenship, this was one of the modes which was well known to the Commission and other institutions. And nobody thought, when they actually agreed to have EU citizenship, in full knowledge of what kind of acquisition techniques there were on the books, that it would be outrageous for some. So now we have a situation where while the European Union cannot decide who the Maltese are, it can use retroactively an undisclosed set of ethnocultural criteria, which have never been formulated anywhere in the law, in order to attack a particular group of Europeans based precisely on those characteristics and those criteria. So those who bought Maltese citizenship are not good enough. And then the question arises. The question which arises is who is next.
Mm-hmm. And I think
who is next is a big question.
Yes, and I think that this is a fascinating debate that could also continue. But let's have the last question for this interview, and let's answer that in 2 minutes, because otherwise we run out of time. And I am interested in your opinion on multiple citizenship. Some people, they have, as you already mentioned, like Italian, maybe Argentinian, maybe other citizenships. And do you think that this is okay to have multiple citizenships, or do you propose or promote the idea of having only one single citizenship?
I pay taxes in the place where my university is registered, but in fact, if you count days, I would qualify for taxation anywhere in the world, and plenty of my friends are the same. So at the heart of your question is the territorial limitation essentially of someone's activities. Of course, with a small footnote that Switzerland means the EU plus EA plus Switzerland, and Madagascar means Madagascar.
Yes.
So in contemporary world, to think about putting overwhelming limitation, knowing that the world is more or less united, as a starting point of thinking about rights, I think is a flawed perspective, especially knowing the origins of multiple citizenship. And the origins of multiple citizenship, of course, is that women emerged as human beings equal to men. something that happened for the first time in the 20s, and then in some countries, in the Netherlands and in Belgium in 1980s. So if a woman can pass on citizenship, and if people travel around more and more, plus they can keep more and more previous nationalities, then we will have more quadruple citizenships and 8-time citizenships and 12-time citizenships than one. And then if you impose one, then the question that arises is, why do you want to harm and to limit the rights that someone has acquired, and in the name of what? So far, no convincing answer has been given, even though some of the member states do limit the number of citizenships. And I finish with one fascinating perspective in this regard, which comes from the United States. The best answer to any kind of limiting nudges that came in the 20th century came from the Supreme Court of the United States, where the court said, in fact, democracy matters. Which means that if someone is a citizen of the United States, that person is entitled to live a life here in such a way that the institutions that represent that person and that act on behalf of that person, Congress, the president, etc., will not be attacking his very being as an American. So if you want to undo someone's citizenship, in fact, what you're doing is you're reconfiguring the people in such a way in order to benefit the idea that the citizen is not sovereign. And I think democracy is about precisely taking a citizen seriously. So in a totalitarian regime, yes, and that's why we see bizarre citizenship policies in the places like Iran and the places like Morocco. But in a democracy, there is no argument for limiting multiple nationality.
Professor Kochenov, many thanks for your insights, for sharing your research outcomes with us. I think this is a fascinating topic. I already have like 10 more questions for the next part, which we may record next year. But anyway, thank you very much for being on IR Thinker.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you.